Imagine a beer so popular that it outsold every single competitor in the United States. A beer so dominant that it earned the title the beer that made Milwaukee famous, a brand so powerful that for decades it sat comfortably at the very top of the American beer industry. Now imagine that same beer becoming so disgusting, so undrinkable, so repulsive that loyal customers who had been drinking it for 20 or 30 years put down their glasses and never picked them up again. Imagine a product so badly ruined that thick, slimy flakes started floating inside the bottles. Customers opened their beer and found what looked like mucus swimming around in the liquid. Bars across the country started refusing to serve it. Distributors sent entire truckloads back to the brewery, and within just a handful of years, a company that had been worth billions was sold off for almost nothing. This is the story of Schlitz beer, and it is one of the most shocking self-inflicted corporate disasters in American business history. Because Schlitz was not destroyed by a competitor, it was not killed by changing consumer tastes, it was not wiped out by a recession or a war or a government regulation. Schlitz was murdered by its own leadership. Executives inside the company made a series of calculated decisions to cut costs and squeeze profits, and those decisions systematically destroyed the one thing that had made Schlitz great in the first place: the beer itself. This is a story about greed, about arrogance, about the catastrophic consequences of putting short-term profits above product quality. And by the time it was over, one of the most iconic brands in American history had been reduced to a ghost. A name on a dusty label that nobody wanted to buy. Let us go back to the beginning. The story of Schlitz starts in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in the 1840s. Milwaukee was rapidly becoming the beer capital of America. German immigrants were flooding into the city, bringing with them centuries of brewing knowledge and tradition. Among them was a man named August Krug, who opened a small brewery in 1849. When Krug died, his bookkeeper, a man named Joseph Schlitz, took over the business and eventually married Krug's widow. Schlitz was an ambitious man, and he saw an opportunity to grow the brewery beyond Milwaukee. In 1871, when the Great Chicago Fire devastated the city and destroyed most of Chicago's breweries, Schlitz sent wagon after wagon of beer south to the thirsty and desperate people of Chicago. It was a brilliant move. Almost overnight, Schlitz became known across the Midwest. The beer that made Milwaukee famous was born. The brewery grew rapidly through the late 1800s and into the early 1900s. It survived Prohibition by pivoting to malt extract and chocolate and other products. And when Prohibition ended in 1933, Schlitz was one of the first breweries ready to start producing beer again at full capacity. By the 1940s, Schlitz had become one of the top-selling beers in the entire country, and by 1947 it achieved something remarkable. Schlitz became the #1 selling beer in the United States of America. It had surpassed Anheuser-Busch and Budweiser. It had beaten every regional competitor. It stood alone at the top of the mountain, and for many years it stayed there. Through the 1950s and into the 1960s, Schlitz and Budweiser traded the #1 and #2 spots back and forth. But Schlitz was always right there at the top. In bars and restaurants and grocery stores across the country, Schlitz was the default choice. It was the beer that working men drank after a long shift at the factory. It was the beer that families served at backyard barbecues. It was as American as baseball and apple pie. But behind the scenes something was changing, and that change would set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately destroy everything the Schlitz family and generations of brewers had built. In the late 1960s, a man named Robert Uihlein Jr. took control of the company. Uihlein was a descendant of the original founding family, and he had big plans for Schlitz. Very big plans. But his plans had almost nothing to do with making great beer. Robert Uihlein was obsessed with one thing and one thing only: the stock price. He wanted to make Schlitz the most profitable brewery in America. Not the best brewery, not the brewery with the highest quality beer. The most profitable. And he believed the way to do that was to cut costs everywhere he possibly could. Now, to understand what happened next, you need to understand a little bit about how beer is made. Traditional brewing is a slow process. It takes time. Good beer requires quality ingredients including malted barley hops, water, and yeast. The brewing process involves mashing the grain, boiling the wort, fermenting the liquid, and then aging it. Aging is especially important. Traditionally, beer would be aged for weeks or even months to develop its flavor and to allow the beer to clarify and stabilize naturally. All of this costs money. Quality ingredients are expensive. Long aging times mean you need more storage space and more tanks. Every day that beer sits in a tank is a day that it is not being sold. And Robert U. Hine looked at all of those days and all of those costs and saw nothing but wasted profit. The first thing U. E. Hine and his team did was start replacing expensive ingredients with cheaper alternatives. Malted barley was one of the most expensive components of beer, so Schlitz began reducing the amount of barley malt in their recipe and replacing it with corn syrup. Corn syrup was significantly cheaper than barley malt, and it still provided the fermentable sugars that yeast needed to produce alcohol. The problem was that it changed the flavor of the beer, not dramatically at first, but the rich, full-bodied taste that Schlitz drinkers had come to expect started to fade. The beer became thinner, lighter, less complex. But the accountants were happy because the cost per barrel was going down. Then they went after the hops. Hops give beer its bitterness and aroma, and they also act as a natural preservative. High-quality hops are expensive, so Schlitz started using hop extracts instead of whole hops. Again cheaper, again a slight reduction in flavor quality. But again the numbers looked better on the spreadsheet. Then came the big one. They went after the brewing time itself. Traditional brewing and aging might take 40 or even 60 days. Schlitz started accelerating the process. They found ways to shorten fermentation. They found ways to reduce aging time. What used to take weeks now took days. They developed a process they called accelerated batch fermentation. The beer was being pushed through the brewery at a speed that would have horrified any traditional brewmaster. But every day saved was money earned, and the stock price kept going up. There was just one problem. When you shorten the brewing process that dramatically, the beer does not have time to stabilize naturally. Proteins and other compounds that would normally settle out during a long aging process remain suspended in the liquid. This means the beer can develop a haze. It can look cloudy. And for a major commercial beer brand, clarity is everything. Consumers expect their beer to be crystal clear when they pour it into a glass. Cloudy beer looks wrong. It looks old. It looks contaminated. No one wants to drink it. So, Schlitz needed a way to artificially clarify the beer since they were no longer giving it time to clarify naturally. Their solution was to use a stabilizing agent called chill guard. Now, the original chill guard they used contained an enzyme that worked reasonably well at keeping the beer clear, but then they switched to a different, cheaper stabilizer. And this is where things started to go horribly wrong. The new stabilizer interacted badly with another ingredient they had introduced. As part of their cost-cutting crusade, Schlitz had started using a cheaper foam enhancer to give the beer a nice foamy head when poured. The combination of this foam enhancer and the new stabilizer created a chemical reaction inside the bottle. Over time, tiny white flakes began to form in the beer. These flakes looked absolutely revolting. They were slimy and stringy, and they floated around in the liquid like something alive. Customers who poured a glass of Schlitz and saw these flakes were horrified. It looked like someone had sneezed into the bottle. Some people described it as looking like mucus or snot floating in their beer. The first reports started coming in, and Schlitz executives initially tried to downplay the problem. They insisted the flakes were harmless, and technically they were right. The flakes were not dangerous to consume, but that completely missed the point. Nobody cared whether the flakes were technically safe. Nobody wanted to drink a beer with mysterious slimy substances floating in it. The damage was psychological and it was devastating. As complaints mounted, Schlitz was forced to act. But instead of going back to their original recipe and their original brewing process, they tried to find another cheap fix. They reformulated again, trying to find a combination of cheap ingredients that would not produce the flakes. In the meantime, millions of bottles and cans had already reached store shelves and bars across the country. Schlitz had to initiate a massive recall. Over 10 million bottles and cans were pulled back from the market. Some estimates put the number even higher. It was one of the largest product recalls in the food and beverage industry at that time. But recalls are not just expensive in terms of the product you are pulling back. They are expensive in terms of trust. Every single person who opened a Schlitz and found flakes in it told their friends. Every bartender who had customers complain stopped ordering Schlitz for their bar. Every distributor who had to deal with returns started giving more shelf space to Budweiser and Miller instead. Word of mouth spread like wildfire. And remember, this was the 1970s. There was no social media. There was no internet. Bad news traveled by word of mouth and in newspapers and on local television. And still the damage was catastrophic. Imagine how much worse it would have been in the age of Twitter and Instagram and TikTok. Now you might think that this disaster would have been a wake-up call. You might think that Schlitz leadership would have realized they had gone too far with the cost-cutting, and that they needed to go back to making quality beer. But that is not what happened. Instead, the leadership at Schlitz doubled down on exactly the kind of thinking that had created the problem in the first place. They believed the issue was not the beer itself, but the marketing. They thought they could advertise their way out of the crisis. And so in 1977, Schlitz launched one of the most infamous advertising campaigns in the history of American marketing. They hired a tough-looking actor to appear in television commercials and deliver a threatening message to viewers. The commercials showed this intimidating man staring directly into the camera and essentially daring people to drink Schlitz. The tagline was meant to be edgy and bold. The actor would say something along the lines of, "You want to take away my Schlitz," and the implication was that if you tried, he would hurt you. The campaign was meant to project confidence and toughness. Instead, it projected desperation and aggression. Viewers were put off by the hostile tone. Instead of making people want to drink Schlitz, it made people uncomfortable. Critics and comedians had a field day mocking the commercials. The ads became a punchline, "Drink Schlitz or else." It was a disaster on top of a disaster. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the company was falling apart in other ways too. Labor relations at the brewery had deteriorated badly. Workers at the Milwaukee brewery went on strike. The strike lasted for months, and it further disrupted production and damaged the company's reputation in its own hometown. Milwaukee was a union town and a beer town, and having your own workers walk off the job was a terrible look. It sent a message that even the people who made the beer did not believe in the company anymore. The numbers tell the story more clearly than anything else. In 1974, Schlitz sold over 24 million barrels of beer. They were the number 2 brewery in the country, right behind Anheuser-Busch, and closing the gap. By 1980, just 6 years later, sales had plummeted to 15 million barrels. By 1981, they had fallen below 10 million. The decline was not gradual. It was a free fall. In the beer industry, losing a few percentage points of market share is considered a serious problem. Schlitz did not lose a few percentage points. They lost more than half their entire business in less than a decade. And the thing about the beer industry is that once you lose a customer, you almost never get them back. Beer is a habit product. People find a brand they like and they stick with it for years, sometimes for life. When Schlitz drove away its loyal customers, those customers went to Budweiser, they went to Miller, they went to Coors. And once they found a new beer they liked, they had no reason to ever go back to the brand that had betrayed their trust. Schlitz could have come back with the greatest beer ever brewed and it would not have mattered, because the customers were gone and they were not coming back. Robert Uhlin did not live to see the final collapse. He died of leukemia in 1976, just as the crisis was beginning to accelerate. But the machine he had set in motion could not be stopped. The executives who succeeded him tried various strategies to save the company, but it was too late. The brand was toxic. The word Schlitz had become synonymous with cheap, bad beer. It was a joke. And in the beer business, your brand is everything. You can change the recipe, you can change the packaging, you can change the advertising. But you cannot change what people think of when they hear your name. And when people heard the name Schlitz, they thought of slimy flakes floating in a glass of watery, tasteless beer. In 1981, Schlitz tried one last desperate move. They actually went back to the original recipe. They started using quality ingredients again. They slowed down the brewing process. They tried to make the beer the way it had been made decades earlier when it was the #1 beer in America. And by many accounts, the beer was actually pretty good again. But it did not matter. Nobody cared. Nobody was willing to give Schlitz another chance. The trust had been broken too completely. The damage was too deep. You can fix a recipe, but you cannot fix a reputation. Not once it has been destroyed this thoroughly. In 1982, the Schlitz Brewing Company of Detroit acquired Schlitz for a fraction of what the company had been worth just a few years earlier. The once mighty Schlitz Brewery in Milwaukee was shut down. Hundreds of workers lost their jobs. The physical heart of the company, the place where Schlitz beer had been brewed for over a century, went dark. The Schlitz acquisition was not a rescue. It was a scavenging operation. Schlitz wanted the remaining distribution network and whatever brand value was left. But even Schlitz could not make Schlitz work. The brand continued to decline under new ownership. Eventually, Schlitz itself ran into financial trouble, partly because the acquisitions it had made, including Schlitz, had saddled it with too much debt. In 1999, Schlitz sold its brands to Pabst Brewing Company. Schlitz became just another name in a portfolio of faded legacy brands. Today, Schlitz still technically exists. You can find it in some stores, usually on the bottom shelf in the bargain section. It is a budget beer, a nostalgia purchase, a curiosity. It sells a tiny fraction of what it once did. The beer that made Milwaukee famous is now a footnote in Milwaukee's history. But here is what makes this story so important. And here is why I think everyone who runs a business or manages a brand or makes decisions about product quality needs to hear it. Schlitz did not fail because of external forces. There was no economic crash that wiped them out. There was no government regulation that shut them down. There was no technological disruption that made beer obsolete. Schlitz failed because the people running the company made a conscious, deliberate decision to sacrifice product quality in order to increase short-term profits. They looked at the ingredients that went into their beer, and they saw costs to be cut, not qualities to be preserved. They looked at the time it took to brew their beer, and they saw waste to be eliminated, not craftsmanship to be protected. They looked at their customers, and they saw wallets to be squeezed, not relationships to be maintained. And the most devastating part of this story is that the cost-cutting worked, at least in the short term. For a few years, the profit margins at Schlitz improved dramatically. The stock price went up. The board was happy. The executives collected their bonuses. On paper, everything looked fantastic. The spreadsheets showed a company that was becoming more efficient, more profitable, more competitive, but the spreadsheets did not capture what was happening in the real world. They did not capture the conversation between two friends at a bar where one said, "Hey, have you noticed that Schlitz tastes different lately?" They did not capture the bartender who quietly stopped recommending Schlitz to customers. They did not capture the grocery shopper who reached for a six-pack of Schlitz out of habit, then noticed it did not taste right and decided to try Budweiser instead. Those millions of tiny invisible moments of lost trust were not showing up on any financial report, but they were accumulating like cracks in a dam, and when the dam finally broke, the flood was unstoppable. There is a concept in business that I think about a lot when I consider the Schlitz story. It is the idea of invisible equity. Every time a customer buys your product and has a good experience, you build a tiny bit of invisible equity. They trust you a little more. They are a little more loyal. They are a little more loyal. They are a little more likely to recommend you to a friend. Over years and decades, this invisible equity builds up into something incredibly valuable. It becomes the foundation that your entire business rests on. And the dangerous thing about invisible equity is that you can spend it without realizing it. Every time you cut a corner, every time you reduce quality, every time you deliver a slightly worse experience, you spend a little bit of that equity. And because it is invisible, you do not see the balance going down. Your sales might not drop immediately. Your profits might actually go up in the short term because you are cutting costs. Everything looks fine on the surface, but underneath the foundation is crumbling. And by the time the cracks become visible, by the time sales start to fall and customers start to leave it, is almost always too late. You have already spent all the equity that took decades to build, and there is nothing left to hold the business together. That is exactly what happened to Schlitz. They spent decades building invisible equity with millions of customers, and then they burned through all of it in just a few years of cost-cutting. And once it was gone, there was no way to get it back. I also think about the role of leadership in this story. Robert Huhine was by all accounts an intelligent man. He came from the founding family. He had grown up around the brewery. He understood the beer business at a fundamental level, and yet he made decisions that destroyed the company his family had built over more than a century. Why? I think it comes down to a fundamental confusion between efficiency and value. Huilian looked at the brewing process and saw inefficiency. He saw expensive ingredients that could be replaced with cheaper ones. He saw time being wasted on aging that could be shortened. He saw money being left on the table, and in a narrow technical sense he was right. The old process was less efficient than the new one, but efficiency is not the same as value. The old process was less efficient precisely because it was producing something valuable. The time and the ingredients and the craftsmanship were not waste, they were the product. When Huilian stripped them away in the name of efficiency, he was not making the process better. He was making the product worse. And in a consumer business, making the product worse is the one thing you can never recover from. There is another lesson here about the difference between what you can measure and what actually matters. The cost savings from using corn syrup instead of barley malt were easy to measure. You could put an exact dollar figure on it. The cost savings from shorter brewing times were easy to measure. The increased throughput from faster production was easy to measure. but the taste of the beer, the satisfaction of the customer, the loyalty of the drinker, the reputation of the brand. Those things were much harder to measure, and because they were harder to measure, they were treated as less important. The measurable savings won out over the unmeasurable value every single time, until the unmeasurable value hit zero and the company collapsed. This is a trap that companies still fall into today. In fact, I would argue that in the modern era of data-driven decision-making and quarterly earnings reports and shareholder pressure, this trap is more dangerous than ever. There is an enormous temptation to prioritize the things you can measure and to ignore the things you cannot. And some of the most important things in business are precisely the things that are hardest to measure. I want to talk about one more aspect of the Schlitz story that I think is often overlooked, and that is the speed of the collapse. Companies usually do not go from number one to irrelevant in less than a decade. Normally, corporate decline is a slow process that plays out over decades. Think about how long it took Sears to decline. Think about how long it took Kodak to decline. Those collapses took 30 or 40 years. Schlitz went from the top of the beer industry to essentially dead in about 8 years. That is breathtakingly fast. And I think the reason it happened so fast is because of the nature of the product. Beer is something people consume regularly. Many beer drinkers have a beer every day or at least every week. That means they are constantly evaluating the product whether they realize it or not. Every single time a Schlitz drinker took a sip, they were conducting a quality test. And every single time the beer failed that test, it pushed them a little closer to switching brands. Compare this to a product that people buy infrequently, like a car or a washing machine. If a car company starts cutting corners, it might take years before enough customers have bad experiences to seriously damage the brand. But with beer, the feedback loop is measured in days, not years. People discovered the decline in quality almost immediately. And because beer is a low-commitment purchase, it is incredibly easy to switch. You do not need to sell anything. You do not need to do research. You just pick up a different six-pack next time you are at the store. The switching cost is essentially zero, which means the punishment for declining quality is almost instant. This should terrify anyone who sells a product or service that people use frequently. If your customers are interacting with your product every day, you have to deliver quality every single day. You do not get to coast on your reputation. You do not get to trade on past glory. Every interaction is a test, and every failure is a step toward losing that customer forever. The Schlitz story also raises an important question about corporate responsibility. The executives who made these decisions profited enormously from them in the short term. They collected their salaries and bonuses and stock options while the quality of the beer was declining and the foundation of the business was eroding. By the time the consequences became apparent, many of them had already moved on or retired. The people who paid the price were the workers who lost their jobs when the brewery closed, the distributors who lost their livelihoods when Schlitz stopped selling, the communities that depended on the brewery for economic stability, the shareholders who watched their investments evaporate. The costs of the cost-cutting were not borne by the people who made the decisions. They were borne by everyone else. This is a pattern we see over and over again in corporate America. Short-term thinking enriches the decision-makers while long-term consequences devastate everyone else. And until we find a way to align the incentives of corporate leadership with the long-term health of the businesses they run, we will keep seeing stories like Schlitz play out again and again. Let me leave you with one final thought. Today, the craft beer industry is booming. Thousands of small independent breweries across America are making incredible beer using exactly the kind of traditional methods and quality ingredients that Schlitz abandoned in the 1970s. These breweries are thriving not despite their higher costs, but because of them. Consumers are willing to pay more for a product that is made with care and craftsmanship and integrity. The market that Schlitz walked away from turned out to be one of the most vibrant and profitable segments of the entire beverage industry. Every time you pick up a craft beer from a local brewery, you are holding in your hand the rebuke to the philosophy that destroyed Schlitz. You are holding proof that quality matters, that ingredients matter, that ingredients matter, that time and craftsmanship and tradition matter, that you cannot cheat your customers and expect to get away with it forever. Schlitz tried to take a shortcut. They tried to make beer cheaper and faster and more profitable without anyone noticing the difference. And for a while it worked. The numbers went up. The executives smiled. The shareholders applauded. But the customers noticed. They always notice. Maybe not right away. Maybe not with the first sip. But eventually they noticed. And when they did, they walked away. Millions of them. And they never came back. The beer that made Milwaukee famous became the beer that taught America a lesson. A lesson about what happens when you put profits above product, when you put efficiency above excellence, when you put the spreadsheet above the customer. It is a lesson that has been taught 1,000 times in 1,000 different industries, and yet somehow there is always another company ready to learn it the hard way. Schlitz is gone now. The great Milwaukee brewery stands empty. The name survives only as a budget brand on the bottom shelf, but the lesson it left behind is worth more than all the beer it ever brewed. Take care of your product, take care of your customers, take care of the invisible equity that holds your business together, because once it is gone, you cannot buy it back, not at any price. And that is the story of how Schlitz beer went from the top of the world to the bottom of the shelf. The beer that made Milwaukee famous. And then made Milwaukee weep.